Hey, so welcome back to Unapologetically Black Unicorns. And as per usual, I have a fantabulous, wonderful, exciting guest. It's somebody that I haven't met in person, but have had the pleasure of talking with him on a webinar, reading his book, talking to him before the book was published. We'll talk about the book in a little bit. And that is Dr. Alex Barnard. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself because you know I don't do the bio thing.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to get to have this conversation and learn more from you. I'm Alex Barnard. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at New York University. I did my PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm the father of two, including a 4-year-old who, on a podcast you can't see, but who loves drawing unicorns and rainbows. So maybe that's why I'm a good guest for this. And I wrote this book, Conservatorship Inside California's System of Coercion and Care for Mental Illness. And it emerges both from my research, but also from my experience as someone living with and with a lot of family members who have lived with mental illness. So that's been something that has been really present in both my academic and my non-academic life.
So this is going to be somewhat the topic of the conversation, about it's about the book, but it's also about sort of, where we are with using coercion and mechanisms of coercion to help people get into treatment, et cetera. And there's mixed opinions across the country, and particularly, what's happening in California and happening simultaneously in New York. But you are in New York, so let's just kind of start here. Like, why California? Like, let's maybe start a little bit there. Like, why did you write a book about California?
Well, partly it was, I was doing my PhD at Berkeley, though I did do part of my research in New York. So I think it's a totally valid question. And I think California, why, like the reason it's worth doing this in California is that so many of the contradictions are just at their extreme in California, right? This is a state that used to have like the highest rate of incarceration in the world, one of the highest of any state, pretty much. It's a state that is home to one half of the unsheltered homeless population. On the other hand, in 1967, California passed the Lanterman-Petraeus Short Act, which was hailed at the time as the Magna Carta or the Bill of Rights for the mentally ill. And it was, a bill that drastically limited involuntary treatment in the state and was one contributor to the pretty rapid downsizing of the state hospital system, which also coincided with a huge amount of cuts to social services put in place by Governor Reagan. So it's this, place full of these contradictions that's both been at the forefront of granting rights to people with mental illness, but also at the forefront of abandoning people with mental illness and sort of reneging on the state's obligation to these individuals. And right now, because of the sort of accumulated consequences of that, the debate around forced treatment in California, I think, is more intense than elsewhere in the country. And some of the expansions of involuntary treatment in California are more dramatic than in other states. Although one of the things I'm doing right now in my research is documenting how many bills have been introduced around involuntary treatment in the US, and it's thousands in the last decade, but California has really been a leader in that.
Wow. And I mean, that's really interesting that in the past decade, there have been thousands of bills to advance forced treatment. And I'm wondering, are you also counting the number of bills that expand and fund robust community-based voluntary services, those upstream things that will hopefully support people, even those with the most serious and complex needs, with, what are considered serious mental health diagnoses or their symptoms are exacerbated to the point of needing more support. So are you counting like these are the number of bills that advance coercion, and these are the number of bills that advance and fund, because I'm going to do the funding part, right? And fund voluntary community-based services.
So the project we're doing is looking at all bills that make some sort of reference to involuntary treatment, forced medication, civil commitment, guardianship, and conservatorship. So we are looking at both ends of that. And you do see some of these contradictory trends that a lot of states are talking about expanding civil commitments. They're talking about more things like Laura's Law, assisted outpatient treatment, so court-ordered sort of obligatory treatment in the community outside of hospitals. And then some states are actually talking about things like supported decision making, particularly since 2021, since the Britney Spears case became very prominent. There is actually more discussion about how to limit some of the restrictions of people's civil liberties and conservatorships. But most of the momentum is going towards more involuntary treatment. Now, states, including California, are making investments in community-based services and peer services. It's often not sort of flagged as or identified as specifically about reducing coercion. And I think that's too bad, because I think, like the degree to which involuntary treatment is happening ought to be one of our most central metrics in the mental health system that we're using to evaluate its performance. And so I think it is really important to have, bills that are saying, like, one of our outcomes that we want to see here is some, reduction in rates of coercion. And I think it's also really important to have bills that are really about this, specifically because of what we know about, racial, in particular, disparities in the use of involuntary treatment. So, states need a plan about this. It's good to invest in community-based services, but I actually think, and this is one of the things, I argue in the book, is like we need to be making those investments with actually like a really big focus on this group of people who are potentially being subjected to involuntary treatment as really like a key target population, rather than just sort of people in general.
Ooh, this is interesting, the way that that was phrased. So, and I think this is what I've heard in the arguments for advancing use of coercion into treatment, is that it's targeting or focused on a very small population of people, because these are folks who haven't been, attended to or focused on before. It's not everybody and his sister. It's just this very small population of people.
I think what I was trying to communicate is, for example, for homelessness, right? And people with serious mental illness is a subset of homelessness in general. There's a lot of debates about how big of a subset. But we know that, in aggregate, the solution to homelessness is housing. It's affordable housing. It's, independent supported housing through a housing first model, gets you into housing right away without conditions and offers you services afterwards. And like the evidence is really clear that that is an effective model for, like the vast majority of people who are unhoused. But I think, in this book, and this is like this uncomfortable language of like target population, but in this book, I did document the stories of people for whom that model, it might not be the right model at all, but it especially might not be the right model right now. That person, potentially needs some treatment and stabilization, but often in a lot of cases, they need kind of a new set of skills. That living on the street requires skills to survive there, but those skills don't necessarily translate to living indoors. And as a result, you do see people who are placed in supported housing and are suffering from medical neglect. They're potentially, extraordinary number of deaths from overdoses in supported housing in places like San Francisco, and people lining up being evicted, which can make it really, really difficult to rehouse them. And so when I think about what I'm saying, we need investments that are really targeted towards that group of people. What I mean is that what is a solution to homelessness, and kind of what is the right solution to homelessness and mental illness in general, which might need to be a little bit more specific and a little bit more creative in how we work with and engage with the specific set of people who right now are on or at risk of going on to something like conservatorship. There's also a need for just much broader kind of preventative services, or just general like social welfare services in the population in general, to prevent us from getting to the point where we have this subset of people who have really complex needs, for whom it's really, it can often be really hard to see a voluntary solution to help those individuals. And so, I think that's actually like a trade-off that's being talked about right now with these reforms to the Mental Health Services Act, right? Like how much money is going to prevention in children, and how much money is going to, extremely high needs individuals who, there are just extraordinary rates of death of people who are unhoused in California right now. And, as long as we have a system that is only willing to allocate kind of finite resources to this challenge, then there are going to be some trade-offs that are just tricky.
It's very, very complex. So that's the other thing that I think, we wanted to talk a little bit about, is how do we respond to the, okay, and this is what I call it. So just get ready for what I'm going to say. I know people are going to come at me, but here we go. I call it dogma dropping or regurgitating rhetoric. And that's what it feels like sometimes, in the advocacy world, is that things come down to a dogma soundbite, and that dogma soundbite then is regurgitated without thinking about, what is it that you've just said, and how does that impact another person who maybe doesn't agree with you, and how does that help us work better together? I mean, this is a really incredibly divisive issue.
Yeah, and I think that the rhetoric, there's rhetoric on both sides of this
Yep.
divisive issue, and and I probably deploy some of it too, right? So don't, but in the conclusion of the book, I talk about what I call like the myth of the criteria and the myth of Reagan. So the myth of the criteria is this idea that there's this subset of people with psychosis, they suffer from anosognosia. The only thing that will work for them is going to be involuntary treatment. And therefore, the sort of solution is to change the criteria for involuntary treatment. And then kind of a lot of other things are going to fall into place because these because the problem right now, the kind of core of the problem for some set of people is that the criteria are too strict. And I think there are many ways in my book, I try and present a more complex narrative than that. I try and suggest, like, when people are refusing services, it's really complicated. There's a variety of factors that are going into that. One is the question of what are those services themselves. When we say they're refusing services, or are they refusing a shelter bed? Are they refusing their own housing? Are they refusing some medication that didn't work for them? Are they refusing a psychiatrist, or is it a peer that's making that offer? So, like, I'm trying to complicate that picture.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think, and this is really relevant to SB 43, I'm also trying to say that the legal criteria, I think, matter a lot less than the organization of the system itself and what is resourced in the system. That if you have locked beds, I think those locked beds tend to get filled, sort of regardless of what's in the law. So that's like one piece of rhetoric that I think is also tied to this idea of, you hear the term dying on the streets a lot, which I think is also true. Like, it's just factually true. Like 2,000 people died on the streets of Los Angeles, and it's just a cataclysmic social failure. But I think sometimes when we say that, we don't actually go step by step and ask, okay, why is that happening, and how much of that is really as a result of forced treatment versus all of these other a result of a lack of forced treatment versus all these other factors.
Yeah, so SB 43 is here in California. It's a bill to expand conservatorship in a number of ways. And so I struggle with sort of top notes, top lines, because I'm intensely curious, and I want to know, well, what's behind that. So I just can't stop at the top line, and I'll go digging
Mm-hmm.
deeper and deeper and try to understand, well, again, how did a person get to this point, or how did the system get to this point? And where are some of the places that we could be making change in order to support the person in the here and now, and also prevent people from getting to the place where that person has arrived. And I think it also requires us not to kind of devolve into this, well, you're well now, you wouldn't understand, or you're recovered, you would. I had a legislator tell me that, a federal legislator tell me that in the middle of a hearing. And I was like, okay, wait, I can't go off on the guy. I just, I'm sitting here kind of like, in a hearing. And by the way, I should say that this legislator is also a psychiatrist. So I thought that was really telling, that, he had this idea that somehow, because one is doing well in the moment, they would have no recall or understanding of what it was like when things were horrific, and what things they didn't like at that time, and what things they did like at that time. And so I totally had to reframe for him. So there were a couple of things that happened. First, I felt like there was stigma happening right there in the room, right there at that moment, right? He was making this, grand assumption that somehow could only be made about people, who have diagnoses of schizophrenia, since that's what we were talking about, and that's a diagnosis I live with. So I basically said, well, wait a second. Would you say that somebody who is in stage 4 cancer remission, they're in remission now, would you say to that person who's in remission, who might be sitting here talking about same type of legislation, that they wouldn't have understood what it was like when they were really, really ill? And he kind of stopped, and he said, no. No, I wouldn't say that. I said, well, why would you say it for somebody who's living with a diagnosis of schizophrenia? So maybe what we should think about is, not so much the diagnosis per se, but I think, you're saying that a person who has a serious mental illness is seriously ill all the time and could not ever kind of get better. And if they do, somehow they're not going to be afforded the same opportunity to speak into what it was like when things were really, really bad. So I asked that we change the language from, serious mental illness to, well, I think what we're talking about is what happens when you have a mental health condition and you're either seriously, seriously ill and you have a whole bunch of complex things that are going on.
Mm.
It's a whole different reframe rather than saying people with schizophrenia are this way and this is the way they're always going to be and blah, 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 blah. I mean, it was real. And he goes, wait a minute, what'd you say? I told him, I said, I think we should really talk about people who have mental illnesses, since that's the word he wanted to use, mental illnesses, and what happens when they're super serious. I think that's what we're talking about. And that's going to be a whole host of things, not just this one thing. And so he actually agreed. And then he told me later, yeah, but it's more sexier if I say seriously mentally ill. And, so it was all about sort of, again, the tropes, the rhetoric, the dogma versus kind of like, well, wow, let's roll up our sleeves and do the hard work here. But I think you're getting into something when you actually were talking about people saying that they want to be heard and that they want to have a sense of point A to point B and when and how do we get from point A to B and when am I done at point B? Like I'm out of here, bye. Everything is, yippee skippy kaye. I think the counter argument to that, so now I'm going to go to a counter just based on how I've understood the narrative of some folks is that, well, what happens if they have anosognosia?
I wanted to ask you that question. So I'm glad we can talk on this because I think, I wrote something on care courts with a sociologist named Neil Gong. And, we talked about the civil court system in which, people with schizophrenia spectrum or diagnosed as or identified as having that will be sort of brought in front of a judge. The judge is going to put in place a care plan and so, tell them that they need to comply with this care plan. And there's a potential threat of a conservatorship behind that. Well, we think maybe there is some value in giving people kind of a firm nudge in some cases, like having a court make sure that there's a coordinated, persistent offer of services that maybe isn't going to force somebody to say yes, but is not going to immediately take no, like is going to keep persisting trying to engage that person. And I think, on one hand, there are people who say, well, that's just, you should take no for an answer. In a lot of other domains of life, we think you should take no for an answer. And so it's, why do people with mental illness, why do you think you should just persist in trying to get that person to accept treatment that they tell you they don't want? But then on the other hand, I think when you write something like that, you do hear some number of people saying, well, what are you even talking about? Anosognosia. It doesn't make any sense that you have this idea that you should listen to people and like really try and figure out the services. Like there are some people, and again, some people, and I don't think anyone's saying everyone, but like some people have anosognosia and therefore there's really no alternative to involuntary treatment in this moment. And in fact, if you treat them involuntarily, they will wind up thanking you. And I think a lot of families that have had this incredibly complex experience of having someone that they love, often like psychosis emerges around the transition to adulthood. They work really hard to get the best services for their child, and their child, again, who becomes an adult, right? So that, and that's important. Like their adult, turns it down, right? To their seeming detriment. And they wind up incarcerated or, horrible things happening to them. And anosognosia really does help make sense of that really senseless, that story. Like it helps them make sense of this sense of, parenthood. This has not been the way they imagined having a child become an adult would look like. They've done everything they thought they should do and they didn't get the outcome they wanted. And anosognosia is just like a really powerful frame for making sense of that. And I think it's part of the story, but I think sometimes it's doing too much work in terms of explaining why people are not engaging with the system. I personally, part of this is related to family experience. Like I've seen something like that, whether you want to call it anosognosia. I see the reality of that. Mm-hmm. But it's so often mixed up with so many other things that are leading people to say no. Yeah. And so, but I don't think it does any good to just pretend that it's not there at all.
Yeah.
but I'd love to hear your pushback or engage. I'd just love to hear what you
Oh,
think
I
of
don't
that.
push people back. I bring people in, just so you know. That's
Okay, sorry.
bring people in as in wanting to have the discussion. And Karis never has all the answers. Karis never has the right answers, but certainly love to have the discussion because I'm always open to learning too, by the way. So I learned something really, really valuable from Dr. Aaron Beck and his colleague, Dr. Paul Grant, that I had never thought of before. And that is our reaction to the word no. The reaction on the provider side or family side or people who want you to do something they want you to do is, why aren't you doing what I told you to do? So no is a bad thing. And so one of the things that they helped me think about, and this was, they were not treating me, this was kind of in a kind of trying to understand how to do the work in a different way, is that no is a very, very powerful word, and it's a word of autonomy. So if we don't listen to that no, because that's a person expressing their autonomy, their self-determination by saying no. So how do we understand the no rather than just kind of saying, I need you to do what I need you to do or what we think is best for you? How do we stop and understand all of the reasons behind the no? And I thought that was really, really interesting because no puts up a barrier. It puts up, just in kind of everyday conversation, no puts up a barrier of either pushing back to get to my yes or pushing back to get to your yes versus stopping and kind of saying, hey, wait, what does that no mean? That's super powerful. I'm so glad that you're expressing your autonomy and your self-determination. Help me understand what that no means. We don't do that. Also, I think that and I have seen and work with people and know people and who do not believe they have a mental health condition, do not believe that they need help. But there's so many things that they do believe. And I'm like, wow, that's a really interesting place to start where they don't have the opportunity to achieve some of the things they would like to achieve. And they'll blame it on all sorts of other stuff that's going on about why not. But trying to work with them on that thing that they really want to do is kind of outside of the way we think about a medicalized model of helping someone. So I think that's where we miss incredible opportunities to create relationship with someone, to build trust with someone, when we're not kind of taking into an account that, there may be beliefs about lots of things that are so important to them that we're not focusing on because we're so paying attention to the thing that they're not accepting. We miss these opportunities because we're so focused on, well, they have anosognosia, so they have no insight. Well, what do they have insight about?
Mm.
The more I think about what happens kind of, or what our expectations are, I was just talking to somebody yesterday about this word adherence. Well, you go into treatment and you're only going to adhere if you take the medication and you have to adhere to the medication, blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking, that's interesting. How do humans adhere to medication? They don't do so well. Like, majority of human beings don't take medication as prescribed. They don't follow through. They don't take it at all. Maybe they'll fill the prescription. They'll take the pill once. They'll sit it there. They'll take the medication. They'll feel better. And they're like, oh, I don't need to take the rest of it. Boom. And it's off to the side. That is a natural human thing. However, when it becomes about, a serious mental illness, it's like we're not allowed to be human. So because you have this court order with these consequences, you're holding a person accountable to being superhuman. And that's problematic for me versus, again, helping a person understand we all struggle with taking medication. What does medication mean to you? What does the taking of medication mean to you? One of my psychiatrists, didn't much talk to me about the side effects of medication. And when I brought one up and said, hey, my goal, speaking of goals, who gets to set those goals? My goal was to have children and to be a mom. And one of the medications stopped my moon time, as we call it, menses. And oh yeah, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. And
Wow.
so I kind of didn't. And then I was like, no, I think I need to worry about that. I said, but wait, I want to have children. And I said, is the medication like stopping my period? And they said, yes, that's actually what it does. And I'm like, okay, well then I don't want to be on this medication. That's the no. That's the power of no. Now I need the person to listen to the no. But the consequence of the longer term use of this medication is that I'm not able to have children. So there goes one of my goals, right? Now I can adopt children, but now I can't adopt children in certain places because I've been involuntarily hospitalized. So there are all of these complexities, like
Yes.
when we're talking about the goals and the consequences, these things do have consequences to people that impact why they want to be involved or not. I mean, that life goal is shot for me. It's shot. Then how do I even trust the system that has like killed my life goal? I wanted to be a mom since I was like, I don't know, three, four. You know, it's just not going to happen because it kind of got effed up by the system. So now what? You know, where do you rebuild my trust? Now it has been rebuilt, clearly. But that's the part where when we talk about anosognosia and understanding where and how we can work with people who don't believe that they need treatment, I think there are lots of different ways to do it. The medicalized system doesn't permit it. That's a systemic barrier.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one thing I say sometimes is that I think we need a mental health system with a more realistic sense of how human psychology works. So it's sort of ironic that the mental health system, I think, has a totally flawed vision of how humans make decisions. I mean, this is going to seem like a ridiculous comparison, but my students need structure for their decision making. Like they need some incentives, they need help getting things in time. And our mental health system has this incredible binary is like sometimes we say voluntary means, if you say no, we're going to close out your file and it's going to be extremely complicated for you to get back into the system. You're going to
Yeah.
be assigned to a totally new clinician and like we start over. Or we're going to coerce you and it's like all or not, like it's 100%, right? Like you make no decisions now. Your no doesn't matter at all. We're not listening to it. But this, I think this requires both sides of this debate to give a little bit because we need actually a mental health system that can work in the kind of gray zones of human volition where people are sometimes they know they need something but they're not really sure that what you're offering is what they need, and there's just a really complicated space in between what we refer to as voluntary and what we refer to as involuntary in this binary way. And I just do want to recognize, I think in this conversation about involuntary treatment, there are these collateral consequences of somebody being involuntarily hospitalized. And I also, at some point in my life, for my own reasons, became aware that if on an adoption application, you have to note that. It's not equivalent to that, but like, the TSA is keeping track. Like there are a lot of institutions actually in our, it's funny that the state of California can't actually tell how many people are involuntarily hospitalized because there are lots of institutions that are paying attention and tracking that.
Yeah.
And so some ways it's surprising that our health system doesn't track that in any accountable way because these things actually do follow people
They do.
for
They
years
do.
in their whole life.
Yeah, even, when I went to work for the federal government, there's a mental health question and a substance use question. And the mental health question in particular, the question is also looking, it asks if you have a mental health condition, it asks if you're still in treatment, it asks if you've had any kind of involuntary hospitalization or any kind of involuntary court order kind of things based on having that mental health condition. So I had to answer those questions. You do have to answer them honestly, of course. It's a government application. So then what happens is somebody will come out and they'll talk. First of all, they'll talk to your provider. So you have to give your provider name, which could create a breach between you and your existing provider when somebody from the federal government has to call and ask about your fitness to do the job. What if you don't get the job because the psychiatrist said no? Well, that might be kind of a hard thing. But they have to talk to your neighbors, and then they come out and they talk to you. And so I met the adjudicator woman, and she said, "Oh, I see that you checked yes here on having a mental health condition." And I said, "Mm-hmm." She goes, "And what is your diagnosis?" And I thought, "Oh, this is not going to go well." I mean, immediately I was like, "Should I be broad? Should I?" And I said, and then I got nervous. I get very literal when that kind of thing happens. And I said, "Well, I have a diagnosis of schizophrenia." And I mean, literally, it was like she closed her book. Like she closed her book, conversation, we're done. And I'm like, "Wait a minute, what's going on?" And she said, "Well, are you in treatment?" And I said, "Yeah, it says right there who my psychiatrist is." "So you take medication for this?" And it's like, Yeah, you know, oh, well, and I said, look, this is going to be my job. I'm going to be the director of the Office of Consumer Affairs at SAMHSA, at the Center for Mental Health Services. And though it is not a requirement of the job, it certainly is an asset of the job to be a person who has experienced these things, who's going to be looking at, the consumer and family involvement in creating the services and supports that we want for our country. So it will be incredibly important to have a person who has these experiences, who has that lived experience, to be in this position. That's why I was courted to apply for the job, why you're sitting here, and why we're having this conversation. Oh, okay. So she opened up her book and we continued on. I mean, that could have been the end of that. I mean, it couldn't have. You can't deny a person a job just on that. There are a whole bunch of other factors they look at. But how many people get to that point in the standard form and stop and don't apply for a job, and they would be excellent for that job because that's been a barrier. So, I mean, there are really big consequences, but I think what happens is people are looking, as you said, at the here and now, and it's very hard for them to see, well, my loved one's never going to work for SAMHSA because they can't see it, and they can't see it in the here and now when their loved one or they themselves are not doing well. So I can appreciate that. And I'm also working really, really hard to appreciate the frustration, anger, and trauma of family members and the fear of seeing their loved ones not get better and not get the lives they deserve. And I think that that's also what drives me, not just what's happened to me, what I see happening to my peers, what I see happening to my community members, when I see people who are, very, very ill and not being able to get into treatment or not finding treatment that they would like or housing that they would like. So, things get, worse and worse and worse. But also because I just see over and over and over and again the same family members just with the same struggles. And like, what the heck? Why is that?
And I think like with a bill like SB 43, and you can disagree, but I think we like there are people who are advocating for these kind of pieces of legislation for the wrong reasons that are kind of, I think there's some street clearing reasons, getting people,
Mhm.
we've got the Olympics coming up kind of reasons. And then there are people who are advocating for these reforms for really the right reasons. And I think that that's really important. And I think it looks like SB 43 is going to be implemented very little initially across the state. But that is why I think there are both groups like Disability Rights California that are going to litigate the heck out of it, and that's their job, is to do everything in their power to try and prevent it from going into place. But I think there are cases where it would be really helpful to have a convening, to have everyone on board, even regardless of how they feel about whether this legislation should be in place, but to think about how this tool can be used in the most accountable way to help people who are being failed by the system right
Right.
now.
Yeah, and I hope we can also work on, again, I don't know if the word is fixing the rest of the systems. And again, it's not one system. I think historically, mental health has been called upon to take on a lot of social stuff, like social structural stuff that was decimated in the 70s and 80s. And that's not technically mental health's job, but that's what mental health has been called to do because the person interacts with all of these systems, sort of that intersectionality with employment and housing and other public health and substance use, et cetera. But it will fall on mental health that generally does not have the resources to do it all. So, I would also love to see us, meaning all of us who are concerned about, number one, anybody with a mental illness, as well as people who are in most need right now, because we don't want anybody with a mental health condition to end up in most need because we've neglected the rest of the system, right? Is how can we come together and think about, what is it that we really need to have robust systems of care, safety net care, to support people along their trajectory or road or interaction with a mental health or substance use condition. That's my wisdom dropping. I don't know. Do you have any do you have any wisdom dropping or anything else you wanted to make sure we touched on? I know people are like, what about the book? We can link to some things where people can hear you talk more about the book. But yeah, is there anything else that we should touch on?
I guess this would be like one other thing I would say is, there's a discourse that's out in the public sphere. And then when you actually get face to face and have a longer conversation with people, I think there are actually a lot of people who have a really nuanced and thoughtful take on this, right? And some of the people who are advocating for SB 43 are also the ones who see the complete failing of a lot of these involuntary services and want humane places for people to go and want investment in upfront voluntary services too. And I think some of the folks who are really opposed to SB 43 are also thinking really hard about what voluntary should mean and how we can rethink voluntary in a way that's more realistic. So like I think trying to have more conversations that are a bit more direct and that involve a bit more list. I think that's the lucky thing about a sociologist is, here I am talking at you, but actually mostly for the book, I just listened for, hundreds of hours of just listening to people. And there's just, people have so much wisdom.
Wow. Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. And, we'll put a link to the book in the podcast description because, it is really worth a read. It's a big book, as I've said.
A tome.
It's a tome. I don't know how many pages a tome is, but it's a big book. And I said that lovingly that it's a tome. And it's really worth the read if especially to kind of get that holistic picture of the history, the stories. It was really, really amazing. It's taken me a while to get through it, but it's really, really an amazing book and gave me new language about things that I'm still looking at even right now in SB 43 or anything is like, well, is the state abdicating its, authority or not? We'll have to see how that goes. So I really want to thank you for joining me on the podcast and having this conversation. I didn't want it to be a straight up interview, but just more of what are our thoughts about this, based on your book and based on both of our experiences. So thank you so much for joining me.
It's an honor to get to talk to you. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, folks. So you know what to do. You can like, subscribe, comment, and also make sure to share. And we will see you next week on Unapologetically Black Unicorns.